Well, anyway, I'd collect the Stiffy Green story. I'd collected The Vanishing Hitchhiker, 3 or 4 stories. And by the way, real authors hate my guts when I tell this story, okay? Because I never intended to write a book. But what happened was I happened to, by serendipity, meet a very kind lady who wrote ghost stories for a living. She did Ohio ghost stories. And I said to her something that people have since said to me. I said, I got this collection of ghost stories. Would you take a look at them and tell me how bad they are? Isn't it amazing how we always assume what we write's got to be terrible? She's a very kind lady, turned out to be a good friend. She said, sure, I'll take a look, I'll give you my opinion. Well, I sent them off to her, and I didn't hear from her for like 6 months. And I knew exactly what that meant. They stunk as bad as I thought they would. And she just didn't want to have to tell me. What I didn't realize is that she liked the stories and had sent them off herself without telling me to a publisher. So literally the first thing I knew about it is I got a letter on my desk at work from Thunder Bay Press saying, hey, we have your stories. We want to send us the rest of your stories and we'll publish your book. And I'm like, what book? What are you talking about? So Haunted Indiana was finished in about 6 months' time after that. After that came a book called School Spirits, which is actually about college ghost stories. And then Haunted Indiana 2, 3, and 4. And then not too long ago, a book called Weird Indiana. And I still write them for one important reason. It's fun. It's fun. Let me be painfully honest with you. If you are looking for deep parapsychological truth or insight into the nature of life and death, you better go somewhere else. Who are you going to call? Somebody else. These books are my venue to be 12 years old again. And sit around a campfire like this. Be able to tell those kinds of stories. A couple of others. Can I tell you another one? Is that okay, guys? Thank you. One of the things that's always fascinated me is how ghost stories become legend. Most stories in general, begin with a historical event of some sort or another. But what I'm always interested in is how they go from that event to being widespread legends. Some stories, by their very nature, are kind of public, you know, and they go from being from private to public consciousness and on into the lore of a community very quickly. Others are held often in small groups, like families or groups of friends, sometimes for generations, before they're ever exposed to the light of public. That was the case of a story that was told to me about 5 years ago in a library in LaPorte by the great-granddaughter of Dr. Uriah Scott. Now, from what she told me, Dr. Uriah Scott arrived in LaPorte, Indiana in about 1921, not long after his service in World War I, with a fresh medical degree in his hand. He was ready to start a new life and a new career, and LaPorte was an ideal place to do both. It was a small community, but growing, and they needed more modern medical care. And so Dr. Scott's practice prospered. After a couple of years of coming to town, he really solidified himself in the society of LaPorte by marrying the daughter of one of the prominent families, and together they built a home, beautiful home, not far from downtown. As Dr. Scott later told the story to his children and them to their children, the incident in question began on a cold, blustery November night in the first year of his marriage. Outside, that cold wind, kind of like tonight, was blowing and rain was splattering against the windows. But inside, well, the fire was warm and his wife was beautiful. And they were enjoying each other's company. When late for them, about 10 o'clock, their peace was disturbed by a sharp rapping on the door. He went to the door, and when he opened it, a sharp blast of night air whipped past him, but the chill that he felt was much more than the temperature of the night, because standing on the doorstep in front of him was an arresting figure. He wore an old-fashioned black greatcoat. He looked like he was of late middle age. There were white flecks in his eyebrows above two of the darkest, most piercing eyes Dr. Scott had ever seen. In a voice as cold as the night itself, the man said, "You're the doctor?" "Yes," said Dr. Scott. "It's my daughter. She's been injured. You will please follow me to my home and tend to her needs." There was something in the man's voice that seemed like someone used to having his orders followed immediately without question. For just a second, Dr. Scott let his eyes drift past that stranger into the night behind him, and for the second time in a few minutes, he felt a wave of uneasiness go through him, because standing in the yard behind him was an old-fashioned horse and buggy. Now, in 1920 or so, LaPorte was still a rural community, but by then cars were the most common means of transportation. The only people who used horses anymore were farmers bringing their stuff in for market day, and there was nothing in the image or bearing of this man that looked like a farmer. He looked back at the man, and even though he felt his reluctance well up within him, he knew the calling of his profession. So he said, "Okay, let me get my coat and I'll follow you out." It was with some relief that he shut the door on the old man. Turned to go in and tell his wife that he had to leave on a house call. And then just on a whim, he said, "Honey, why don't you come with me? Why don't you come with me this time?" She said, "All right." So the two of them put on their coats and they went to the side yard, started the car. They slowly followed that horse and buggy through the night and the rain, going east out of LaPorte a long distance. Then turning up a country road that Dr. Scott never remembered being on before. Again, they traveled a long time. So long, in fact, that Dr. Scott began to wonder if he was the victim of some sort of a practical joke. When the wind, blowing the clouds past a full moon, let it shine down on a sight he later said he'd never forget. It was a mansion, at least by rural northwest Indiana terms, 3 stories tall with a wide front porch and tall wooden columns. Dr. Scott just had time to think that he had never heard of a mansion out east of town, but the thought was quickly erased as he saw the horse and buggy pull up in front of it and the old man alight. Dr. Scott pulled in behind and turned off the car and said to his wife, "Honey, why don't you stay here? This can't be much of anything. I'm sure it's something simple. I'll be back in a few minutes." But he began to question his own easy surmise as the old man wordlessly conducted him over the threshold of the house, because there was what appeared to be fresh blood smeared along that threshold. More of it was splattered on the wall behind. Dr. Scott shot a look at the old man, but the old man simply motioned for him to follow him up a set of stairs. They went up a set of tall stairs into the second-floor hallway. Going down the hall, they opened a door, and he found himself in a small bedroom.